Hey there, Truth Seeker. Welcome to our channel and community where we discuss 13-sign astrology. Our focus today is the solar eclipse occurring Tuesday, April 9, 2024 at 6:20 a.m. New Zealand. For friends and followers in the United States, this equates to Monday, April 8 at 2:20 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We are changing our format to an interview style, and we look forward to have a conversation about this important astrological event. I am Sana, and I will be asking David questions and might share some of my own insights. Without further ado, let's jump in. Hi, David.
Hi.
So it is a pretty spectacular full solar eclipse, and unfortunately here in New Zealand, we will not be able to witness it. But the sun and moon, and together with Chiron and Mercury, they are all conjunct in Pisces. So I would love for you to explain to us what kind of impact that might have for the individual, but also for the collective of humanity.
Sure. Anytime you get 4 or 5 planetary bodies lined up like that, there's a lot going on. And then you add to it that there's an eclipse or a full eclipse. It's even more impactful. So I get that out of the way straight away, is that this is going to be a game changer in so many ways at both an individual and, as you pointed out, a collective level. Let's go through firstly setting the scene in terms of this eclipse, which follows hard on the heels of the penumbral lunar eclipse that we blogged about, which was a couple of weeks ago. And in that blog, we talked about rather, that the penumbral, or the nature of a penumbral eclipse, it was to do with the shadow.
Yeah. And
the shadow aspects of humanity, both again at an individual and collective level. And what we're talking about here is the parts of ourselves that we don't effectively like very much. And so therefore we push them away and discard them. And as I said, that can apply as much to us as individuals as it does to a collective or even in a nation state. There are characteristics of groups of people that aren't particularly palatable or socially acceptable, I think is the term. So shadow is really to do with pushing that away. So that was the precursor. And I think it's important for context to understand that this eclipse and that eclipse of 2 weeks ago are linked. The difference between the two is that a lunar eclipse, of course, a full moon, is to do with our internal planes, our emotions, our unconsciousness, whereas this is very much on the external planes. Given that it's a new moon, it's a beginning of a cycle, and it represents a transition, a time of transition. So the effect of it being in Pisces, it's the house that we call the house of course, dissolution and emergence. And what we mean by that is that because it's the 12th house in the astrological wheel, this is where everything ends and everything begins, in simple terms. So we're coming to the end of a cycle, and that cycle can be both representative of the solar cycle, which is obviously a 12-month cycle, but within that there's even deeper cycles, some of which go back many, many years. So we're coming to this finality, this conclusion, this ending event. And at the same time, because it's in Pisces, we're also going to emerge. And it's that classic, as one door opens, another closes, or as one door closes, another opens. So we're very much going through a doorway, a transition, a stargate, a portal from one state to another. So it's a phased change. And the theme that's running through this will absolutely be about something's ending and something's beginning. Now, when we talk about the influence of the two bigger planetary bodies, firstly Chiron, we're definitely talking about a collective shift. So Chiron, the asteroid Chiron, is the archetype of collective and individual pain and trauma. It's what I like to call in astrology the moment or the point in the chart where we are most far away from our relationship with the source creator. So this is where we have an experience of alienation from source. It's where we feel that we might be cut off from source. And typically that alienation or feeling cut off from our creator is to do with layers of trauma and difficult experiences. In other words, some of this will be to do with shadow. So again, we go back to that 2 weeks ago, the themes and the recurring theme there was what's emerging that we need to deal with and confront in our lives. And very much it's coming to a head again 2 weeks later at the solar eclipse. So the effect of Chiron is to do with, as I said, both individual and collective trauma. And we'll talk a little bit more about the opposition, but I'll touch on the opposition to Zeus, which is one of the trans-Neptunians. So that trauma, the context of that is in and around our ideas of leadership. Now, leadership is a very complex subject, but the context for this is who do we look to for information? Who do we look to for guidance? And our earliest understanding of leadership usually comes from within the family, whether it's from our mother or father or those parental influences. I mean, there's an expression, it takes a village to raise their kids. So it may not have been the mother or father. It could have been a relative, a brother, or even a sister, is where our first ideas of leadership. So this is where the trauma is going to manifest. So when we look at Chiron, in Pisces and an eclipse, we are looking at the dissolution and emergence of our ideas about leadership. And that will go very much back to not only our childhood, but also our parents' beliefs and their parents' beliefs, and even 2 or 3 generations prior, because these things tend to come down the generations and be passed through as ideas, as concepts. So we're talking about a collective trauma with the opposition to Zeus, which we'll dive into more separately. But I'll just touch at this point that this is very much to do with our concepts and ideas of leadership. And then we've got Mercury in the mix as well. Now, Mercury is the archetype of communication, it's relating to how we communicate with each other, obviously, but it's also relating to what we call our ideas of the world. So the planet Mercury is tied up with the 3rd house, obviously, of Gemini. It's the guardian planet. So Mercury is about the nitty-gritty detail, whereas Sagittarius, it's opposite, which we're not talking about today, but just for context, the opposite of Mercury and Gemini is, of course, Sagittarius and Jupiter we will touch on. So we're talking about a nitty-gritty, which is the Mercury influence, detail. We're talking about collective and individual trauma. We're talking about a beginning and an ending and a transition phase. And we're also talking about the context of leadership and our ideas about leadership, and that's the influence of Zeus, which is sitting opposite this solar eclipse. And there's another planetary body in there, of course, which is Icarus. And this is one of our favorites to talk about because the myth of Icarus is reasonably well known. It is the Icarian Sea in the Mediterranean was named after this myth. It comes from the Greco-Roman pantheon. And it was the idea that Icarus, the son, and the father were held in captivity up in a high mountain above the Icarus or Icarian Sea in the Mediterranean, and they wanted to escape. And they fashioned some wings from birds' feathers and wax. And the father said to the son, don't fly too close to the sun because your wings will melt. And of course, with the bravado and the brashness of youth, that the youngster thought he knew better. And as it turned out, the father descended safely with his wings, but the son went up and of course did fly too close to the sun, and the wax on his wings melted and he plunged to his demise in the sea. And so the lesson, the moral of that story is take calculated risks, but be aware that any time we're in a transition from, an ending to a beginning, which we've talked about with Pisces, the dissolution and emergence, there's going to need to be some courage. There's going to need to be some risks taken. And this is going to be in and around our beliefs and how those beliefs were formed in the first place. And so there'll be some challenges with this eclipse. There'll be some mental challenges, particularly with the Mercury influence, more than emotional, although, this could be highly emotional, but it's likely to be more mentally challenging and taxing of us in terms of our left brain faculties, and challenging the idea, and this is where the risk comes in, of getting outside of our comfort zone. So the universe is almost saying to us, hey, look, you've got some ideas there at both an individual and a collective level about leadership. And some of them need to be put on the table and you need to have a really good look at it. And this can be anything from, as I said, in the household, to the boss at work, to the head of state, to the school board that you might be a member of. Wherever there is leadership structures, this is what's on the table right now.
And so if someone is not taking that calculated risk, is then the influence of Mercury at this time, you can really think yourself crazy by just overthinking things?
Absolutely. And yeah, look, paralysis by analysis is the term that comes up straight away. I think it's well understood that Mercury relates to the left brain consciousness. And yes, we can be like a hamster in a wheel, overthinking things. But of course, the Icarus myth is really about taking action as well. And that's the key central theme here, is it's not just about understanding our ideas of leadership structures at an individual and collective level. It's also about taking action as well.
Because, the sun also is action. So it's all about, at a new moon, the sun is it's in the same sign as the moon, opposite to when it's in full moon, where you are dealing with two different energies. So it's, we see the new moon as a new change, but also being action orientated by that extra influence of the sun being there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you've already touched on Zeus. So Zeus, when we look at the chart, sits opposite in Virgo. So how do you see really the Virgo also being governed by Mercury? So there's lots of Mercury energy at this time. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, look, there's clearly, and we're going to talk about another influence of the Gemini Mercury influence as well, with the square down to Kronos. So firstly, Zeus. For those who are unaware, Zeus is what they call a trans-Neptunian object, or a TNO. It's absolutely part of the astrological mosaic. And we talk about asteroids and, these planetary bodies such as Zeus, Kronos, we're going to talk about shortly, Icarus, Chiron, because we believe that it provides a big picture, and it also provides some insights that perhaps others who are focused more on traditional astrology won't probably be looking at, or even considering the influence of Zeus or Kronos or Lilith or Pallas Athena, which we will get to later. But talking about Zeus, so I mentioned in the first part that, anytime there's an opposition or a square, for those who understand a little about the way that the astrological tensions manifest, they come out, or tensions tend to come out when you have two planetary bodies or more than two planetary bodies sitting in opposition. So you always get a tug of war scenario going on. So on the one side, we've just talked about this grouping of the sun, the moon, Icarus, Mercury, and then that's on one side of this. So if you imagine a tug of war, you've got this group on one side, and then you've got Zeus on the other. Now, in terms of the archetypes, Zeus is absolutely to do with leadership. And some astrologers will say that Zeus and Jupiter are very much related, but I like to separate them. I mean, they are and they aren't, and it depends on some of the mythology here. In the Greco-Roman, I'm not sure which is which, but one called Jupiter, and then the other one is Zeus, and they're both relating to that same expansive energy. But Zeus gives us a little more nuance, where most people will understand Jupiter as being the planet of expansion. Zeus is very much to do with expansion of leadership and the ideas of leadership. And so what are we talking about here? We're talking about concepts of, firstly, who sits in the leadership structures, how they got their power in the first place, how they wield and use that power. If you take a situation like a head of state or a president or a prime minister, they are supposedly elected to represent us. If you think about your boss, you didn't necessarily elect that person, you just got given that relationship, more or less, unless you are the boss. But what we're getting at here is, even within the household, there tends to be a more dominant and a more figure, and that may be the male or the female, or it might even be one of the kids. So leadership is a very complex subject, and this is why the Mercury influence is so important here, because we're talking about not just the big picture of saying, oh, well, I don't like my leader, or I don't understand the ideas of leadership. This is about getting into the detail of it and really unpacking it. So the opposition asks us, or the universe is asking us, to not just think and talk about it, but to actually go through the process of deconstructing what leadership is. And, there's even a debate about whether leadership and management are the same thing. I think they aren't, but this is part of what's on the table right now. And the tension is the question that emerges here at the eclipse is the leadership effective? Is it functioning in a way that is helping me to advance myself, to evolve at an individual level? In other words, is it a supportive or nurturing type of leadership, which tends to be a more feminine quality? Or is it a more of a, my way or the highway type leadership? So you've got these kind of different polarities of leadership, and which tends to be associated with a masculine view. And then there's another nuance to leadership as well, which is coming up here, when it's top down versus bottom up. Yep. So most of us understand the concept of a triangle, and at the top, most leadership structures, whether it's in business, religion, politics, school systems, there's hierarchies everywhere, and there tends to be a very small concentration of decision makers who are hopefully, with wisdom, making decisions for the greater good, for the collective. But that isn't always the case. And there's very much an inversion going on in the world right now from a bottom up, where crowdsourcing of ideas and what's going on at the bottom of that, where people they have a voice and they want to feel like, I've got something to say here, and leaders need to recognize that it's not just about their ideas, it's also about listening to others and collaborating. So this is a complex subject, and as you pointed out, with Zeus sitting in Mercury, in Virgo, which is ruled, of course, by Mercury. You know, Virgo is the house of detail, and because of the Mercury influence. So take some time to think about these things and figure some stuff out, because that's what we're being asked to do at this time.
Right. And again, you've already touched on it briefly, but so there's also the square to Kronos in Gemini. Again, Mercury energy conjunct with this eclipse. So many people, I don't think, would have heard of Kronos. So Kronos, again, from the Greco-Roman and associated with the Saturn energy, if I'm correct.
Yep. So again, Kronos is one of the trans-Neptunians and adds a whole lot of dimension and depth to any astrological readings, especially in a 13-sign system. And like the Jupiter Zeus, Kronos is very much related to Saturn. And the reason for the two names is because you've got the Greeks calling Saturn one thing and then the Romans calling Saturn another. But what that allows, as I just talked about with Zeus and Jupiter, is some nuance and some subtlety. And so we see a reinforcement once again with the opposition to Zeus, the presence of Mercury in the solar eclipse in a conjunction to the sun and the moon, the presence of Chiron, which we talked about. There's a collective trauma here that's emerging, that's coming to the surface, and there's also an individual trauma. And the role of Kronos reminds us of the dangers of tyrannical leadership.
Right.
So this is the shadow side of Saturn, and where the overbearing structures or leadership structures, which typically exist in politics, which typically exist in the economic system, which typically exist in social structures everywhere, you know, whether it's the village, the king in the village, or whether it's the queen, you know, you see those leadership structures even within the animal kingdom. So they're everywhere. So the idea of an alpha or a leadership going off track is what the Kronos archetype's all about. So Kronos is very much reminding us that through the square relationship with the eclipse and in Gemini, is that we need to understand not only the positive aspects of leadership and what we would like to see both in ourselves as an exemplar of leadership. So in other words, be the change you want to see in the world, that's leadership. But also, if we're going to point fingers at a head of state, or we're going to point fingers at the boss at work, or we're going to point fingers at the principal at the local school or the local councillor, whoever's in these leadership positions, we need to understand that as much as we're looking at what we don't like, we also need to look at what we do like.
Yep.
But Kronos is very much about getting that balance and saying this isn't a one-sided equation. This is where the courage of Icarus comes in, and this is also where that Chiron wounding comes in, because these can be difficult subjects. And I'm from very much a tribal background. Half of my DNA is African, and I've come out of, my lineage comes very much out of there's a king, there's a warrior. And challenging some of those ideas or concepts can be difficult. Within corporate structures, it can be incredibly difficult to even have a discussion with a tyrannical leader. And certainly most of us know that where there's a head of state, for example, or a hierarchical system that has gone off track, that clearly isn't listening to the people. This is the bottom up versus top down. It's incredibly difficult to engage with that leadership structure. We see that in religion, we see that in education, we see that in the unions who are uprising about, cost of living and this sort. You see it everywhere. So the Kronos square is very much about understanding, dissecting, and deconstructing the shadow and the tyrannical side of leadership, and understanding that if it goes off course, what checks and balances do we have to bring it back into alignment, and how do we go about doing that? So, yeah, I mean, we have, just to labor the point, we have obviously a lot of mercurial energy here.
Yeah.
And of course, when we go and when we look at the two pillars, you know, the symbol for
Gemini.
Gemini, and of course, Gemini and Mercury, that's very much about what I'm saying, is that this is about getting both sides of the story and making sure that we understand what the positive is and the negative, the shadow and the most positive expression of leadership. And we put all of that down on the table and we have a look at it, and then we go from there.
Yeah. And what you said before about be the change you want to see in the world, I think it is such a big part of moving forward, of you know, let's take this new moon full solar eclipse. It's really be that exemplar. You know, if you're not happy with the way the school is run, then go and become part of the board of trustees. If you are not happy the way that rubbish is collected, then come up with solution and present that. I think that a lot of people are just complain. But if we want to really see a change, then we need to step up, think about the two sides, what's working, what's not working, and how can we then move on from that. And it sounds like this is a perfect place and time to do that. So let's change tack a little bit. So we follow the 13 sign astrology system, where we use the true position of the astrological bodies, the planetary bodies in the zodiac. And so we include the constellation Ophiuchus. And right now we have a beautiful conjunction of the asteroid Lilith and also Pallas Athena, who are just entering Ophiuchus. So would love to hear your thoughts on what does this mean in terms of the divine feminine at this particular time at the solar eclipse?
Yeah, and this is one of the more amazing alignments that are taking place at the solar eclipse. And firstly, if following 12 sign astrology, this has been probably completely missed, but is so important. So for the proponents of sidereal astrology, which is very common in Vedic and Eastern readings, by the way, they tend to use the position of the sun in the sky. So Ophiuchus, or the constellation of Ophiuchus, as we've talked about in previous blogs, I think the first thing to understand is that this is the fifth element. This is the energy of the fifth element. So, you know, we understand, I think most of our listeners will understand that there are four primary energies that make up matter and our experience of life, which is air, earth, water, and fire. And of course, those elementals or modalities are applied to the various astrological signs, you know, with Aries being fire, for example, and Taurus, earth, Gemini, air, and Cancer, water, and so on. But where does Ophiuchus fit in? And this is what makes this so interesting, is that in our view, Ophiuchus represents that fifth element of ether. And ether permeates everything. And we're talking AETHER. It's the field. This is the womb of creation. So with that little preamble first about Ophiuchus, let's have a look at the two archetypes that are conjunct there, which is Pallas Athena and the asteroid Lilith. Firstly, Pallas Athena represents she again is a historical figure in myth and legend, also known as Minerva. I think it was the Romans that called her Pallas and the Greeks called her Minerva, or the other way around. Apologies if I've got that wrong or reversed. But the qualities of Pallas Athena was that she was firstly very, very highly regarded and esteemed within the Roman pantheon. She held a high post. She was considered an advisor to the head of state. She was in that kind of cabinet space or senate space where, which was incredibly uncommon, both from historical fact, but also mythologically. It was very uncommon to have a feminine influence in amongst that patriarchal structure. And we've just talked about the leadership structures through Kronos and Zeus, and that the challenge for us, the trauma for us as individuals and collectively is dealing with this, that there are structures in place, political, economic, social, religious, and so on, that have been in place for a long, long time, but they've been very male dominated. And so that's part of the problem, what we believe is part of the problem, because there's no diversity of thought there. There's only tending to be, this left brain orientation to the way that the world should be. So the presence of Pallas Athena reminds us that actually there is a role at the leadership table for the feminine. There is a role for the divine feminine energies. And what we're talking about here is the qualities of collaboration and the qualities of intuition and creativity and bringing a whole right brain perspective to some of the issues that we're confronting. And Pallas Athena was that. She was not only patron of the arts, she was an overseer of the whole artistic expression coming through in the Greco-Roman pantheon, but she was also, as I said, this advisor to state. And so she exemplifies the Mars energy, the masculine Mars energy, but she also exemplifies this ability to use what we call a whole brain, so to move from the left into the right, and to come at an issue from both sides. Again, it's in alignment with what we were just talking about with the two pillars with Gemini and Mercury. So when we talk about the divine feminine energy, we're talking about a fifth element, an energy coming in here that most people wouldn't consider, but is so desperately needed right now, as part of, this is where the inspiration and the insights and the eureka moments and the whole, oh my goodness, I didn't see it, and then suddenly I see something. This is where innovation and ingenuity comes to the table. So Pallas Athena represents strategic leadership. What she represents is that ability to operate in a masculine, male-dominated environment and still be very, very effective. She is the quintessential 3D chess player. She had the ear of the men. They listened to her. So we're talking about a very strong personification of the feminine energy in this leadership discussion. But then at the same time, we've also got the asteroid Lilith. Now, Lilith is often not talked about, but there are some YouTube bloggers, and I've heard some really wonderful descriptions of her. I just make the point about Lilith that if you are casting a chart or you're looking at a chart, there are different types of Lilith configurations, but we use the asteroid Lilith, which is an actual physical body that can be seen in the night sky, can be mapped in the night sky if you're looking at software, rather than a point in the sky, which is what some software programs do. So the asteroid Lilith, to us, she represents the first Eve. She represents the first female. She is the mitochondrial Eve energy. So in other words, this is the feminine that has been very distorted in many, many ways. It has been socialized through obviously religious writings. Everyone knows about Adam and Eve has been blamed. Eve got blamed for being tempted, and she got blamed, as the stories go. She ate the apple and she was tempted by the serpent. And so there is a side of Lilith, or Eve in this case, that people don't, they might be we don't want to talk about that, but that's exactly the point. This is exactly the point of where the courage is required. This is one of those moments where we have to look at that whole idea of, was in fact Eve or Lilith brave enough to make her own decisions and to go forward? Well, that's leadership. Well, that's Icarus.
Yeah.
You know, whether that's right or wrong is totally subjective, but that's part of what's going on here. But also the myth of Lilith is to do with, there's a story there where in some texts and some historical references where she left an oppressive relationship. She had the courage to step away from a domineering, overbearing man, and she took flight and decided to break the mold of staying. I'm not going to stay in this relationship because I'm not being treated as an equal. So there's some very, very strong characteristics that are tied up, and despite some of what we would call the distortions around Eve and Lilith, there's some qualities there that the universe is saying, hey, you know, look, the combination of Pallas Athena, who has a seat at the table, but this may also require particularly some females who have a voice to actually break away from what is a restrictive male-dominated leadership type structure or an environment which isn't allowing them to be heard or to express themselves. And I think the final thing about that particular combination there is that it's important to realize that these archetypes, particularly Pallas Athena and Lilith, the divine feminine, they can exist also in males. It isn't necessarily, oh, I'm a female, therefore I exemplify these qualities or these shadow aspects. They can show up in a male just as much as in a female, just as much as masculine qualities such as, you know, let's take Mars. Mars is a great, you know, probably the easiest example. But an over masculine expression within a feminine, you know, might come across as brutality or, you know, just a blind kind of pushing ahead without much consideration, which is the shadow side of Mars. So it's very important that this isn't just a call out to the females out there. This is a call out to males as well to engage your right brain, because that's where that feminine, divine feminine creativity exists and dwells. And if you're struggling, if you're in a leadership position, or you have been subject to some oppressive leadership or tyrannical structures that we've talked about, or you have some great ideas, it's time to speak up.
Yeah, and what I would like to add is that if you are a male, you know, stand up for those divine feminine qualities in others as well. It's not just that you have to rise above, but it's also really supporting those others, you know, having that community aspect of raising a village for a child. But it's also, the better we look after our community, the better the community can look after us as well.
Yeah, and, you know, that brings to mind the idea that, you know, part of what we're being challenged to do individually and collectively is to look at roles and responsibilities. I mean, what are those typical roles that, you know, there's some really outdated thinking here about what is the role of the masculine and the role of the feminine. And we see, you know, great examples of where some of those ideas, which is, again, what this is Mercury energy. These are ideas and beliefs that are getting broken down. You know, we have, you know, we're down under here in New Zealand, but, you know, the other day we were watching some, you know, footy, and there was a female ref, right? So she's broken through in a very male oriented sport, and that whole thing's got a female ref. So that's just a tiny little example in a very practical sense. This eclipse is about taking action. You know, when we come to summarize what we've talked about today, we always got to come back to where the penumbral was about going inwards and reflecting and introspecting and working on the inner planes. This is very much about taking ideas, actions and putting them out there in the world and making sure that we actually do something. We don't just sit back and, you know, and so the roles and responsibilities need to be reconfigured and rethought. And that's very much, again, about the Pallas Athena Pallas Athena conjunct Lilith and Ophiuchus is, hey, challenge those ideas you have about the mother stays at home and it's a feminine thing to be a nurse and it's a masculine thing to be the doctor, which is ridiculous.
It is. It is. So a couple of blogs ago, we got to hear your beautiful singing voice about the age of Aquarius, because Saturn is in the same position now as it was in the mid-60s in Aquarius, but he's got another planet coming very, very close now. They're only a degree apart, and that is Mars. So we have Mars conjunct Saturn in Aquarius. How does that tie in with this solar eclipse?
This is, and without repeating what we did in that blog, and we encourage our listeners and viewers to go back and listen to that if you haven't already. But the cliff notes are that Saturn takes around about 30 years to come all the way around. So he starts, say, in Pisces, and will take about somewhere between 28 and 30 years to come the full circle, go through all the constellations and come back to where he started. So he's done 2 cycles since the 1960s, and we're talking about 1964 to 1966 particularly. And sometimes the historical, with these bigger planets like Saturn, Pluto, Neptune, Jupiter, that move, Uranus, and we'll touch on him as well, that move very slowly relative to the other planets. I mean, the sun's moving at 1 degree per day. The moon's moving even faster than that. Mercury and Mars move incredibly quickly too. And so their energies tend to be quite fleeting, but the Saturn energy is slower. And if we go back 2 cycles to where Saturn was in that period, 1964 to 1966, and what that blog was all about, of course, this is so important with this Pisces energy of dissolution and emergence.
Yeah.
You know, we are on the cusp of, you know, both individually and collectively, a big, big change. Some would call it the Age of Aquarius. Well, what we presented in that blog was, if you look at Saturn as perhaps a marker of some of these big shifts in the political system, in the economic system, in the media system, in the education system, in the health systems, even in the, you know, the legal and the regulatory space, anywhere where there's those big Saturn structures, when he revisits, you know, it comes back full circle, which is what he's doing here. We go back to what was going on, what on earth was happening the last time he was in this exact position, and then amplify that, because with the conjunction with Mars, which is all go, 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 right? Yeah. This is, of course, Mars is the next, is the ruler or is the guardian of Aries, and Aries is the next house from Pisces. And so what we're getting here is, you know, we're dissolving our ideas. We're having to think about, we've come full circle in terms of a whole lot of ideas. Again, the context specifically about leadership and roles and responsibilities of men and women within the political, economic, educational, health structures, and so on and so forth. But it's very interesting, it's very telling, between 1964 and 1966, when Saturn was in this exact position. If you go back historically, there was a whole lot of things which we're also having to deal with now, such as, yeah, this was well understood that, you know, Walter Cronkite, the TV anchor, would be very well known to some of our older viewers. He was the kind of the face of the mainstream media, and the whole idea that the TV anchor, again a male, interestingly, could take on the establishment. And the media in those days, I think, was called the Fifth Estate. And the Fifth Estate was supposed to be sitting there holding the judiciary and holding the legislature and the governmental structures, holding it all to account. Whether that's happening now is debatable. But this is interesting because in 1964 to 66, this is what was being talked about. We had the proliferation of the TV screen in the suburban environment, where mum, dad, and children, and the whole idea of the white picket fence was beginning to come into reality. And we had this massive polarization that was also occurring around the world. This was well known that there was an enormous protests against the Vietnam War. There was enormous consternation about nuclear armament. There was the Cold War going on between Russia and the US. There was a kind of, there was these massive historical figures that still talked about today, like JFK, Martin Luther King. There was the birth of huge movements, feminism, civil rights, as well as the media that was promulgating and pushing all of this out. Cronkite became the archetype or the template of the news anchor, the 6 p.m. news bulletin, which is fragmented today, but really was very strong. And people used to be informed about the world through that whole process. They could sit in their lounge and they could see that there was, protests going on in Warsaw and Eastern Europe, and there was also protests in London, and there was bombs being dropped in Vietnam and napalm, and there were some horrific events going on, and there were these strong political figures that were very polarizing. There was the death of JFK, there was the rise and fall of Martin Luther King. There was just so much going on. And so Saturn reminds us that that's all on the table as well.
Yeah.
And, some of those historical, that was, again, on the artistic side, we go back to the patron of the arts and Pallas Athena as a reference point. You think about some of the huge festivals that were taking place, the Woodstocks and so on and so forth. There was this, that whole song, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, as an anthem, and it defined a generation. And, we, as the generation in 2020s, probably need to go back and have a bit of a look at that and think, well, how on earth, what happened? What were the ingredients that took place that allowed those uprisings? Because they tipped over some of the power structures. And this is what we're talking about. They inverted some of the pyramid structures with the man at the top, or the command and control structures, and they really challenged it. And we're still dealing with the legacy of some of that today. So really, Saturn is a marker of an end of a massive cycle, and his position right now at this eclipse, and also in 2024, is saying humanity, go back to that, what you would call the beginning of the age of Aquarius, and think about what's going on with this this solar eclipse, because you're in this process of Pisces. What is it that you're dissolving, and what are you going to emerge into, and what are you going to start and commence and kick off? And that's what Mars is all about. Mars is number one. It's red. It's the bull. It's right. We're ready to go. Right. We've come through this whole transition in this eclipse in Pisces, and not long after that, within 3 to 6 months, we're ready to go. And as I said, that can be at an individual level and at a collective level. So a very, very important combination or conjunction of planets taking place right now. And of course, that's all happening in 13th sign in Aquarius.
That's right.
Yes, in the 12th sign, they will have that. They'll be talking about that conjunction, but they'll be talking about that in Pisces. But, we don't believe, well, that's actually not, if you look at a night sky app, that's not where Saturn is. Saturn is conjunct Mars in Aquarius. So this is about, you know, the dissolution of the Piscean age and the emergence of the Aquarian age. And I'm not sure that the universal intelligence, the source consciousness, could make it much more clear that this is actually, hey, this is what's going on.
Yeah. So as we have just talked about Aquarian energy, the ruler of Aquarius being Uranus, and if we look at the tarot card, it's the lightning striking the tower, and Uranus is now conjunct Jupiter in Aries. So this will be the last piece that we'll discuss today. So how does that tie into this time?
One of the things that amazes both of us, and we talk about this, of course, all the time, is that Source has this incredible, infinite ability to just scatter all of these pieces that appear to be kind of randomly organized. But then when you have a look at it through the lens of an astrological chart, you can actually see that there's a whole lot of really clear dots being joined, right? That you can see this links with this, and this links with this, and this, and this, and you see the big picture. And yes, absolutely, with Uranus, of course, for the astrology lovers, the tarot lovers, that is one of the most dramatic cards in the Rider-Waite deck. You know, it's this is lightning striking a tower, what people would call, you know, some sort of an edifice constructed on a high place, a metaphor for disruption of leadership, a metaphor for disruption of those sitting in those places looking down on the rest of us, and then suddenly boom, and they're cast out, and it's all on. So, you know, it's a very interesting looking at the relationship mythologically between the role of Uranus, also known as the Sky Father, and of course Kronos and Saturn, which, as the myth is told, they were the children of the Sky Father and the Earth Mother. So we're talking about originally that the Sky Father, Uranus, and the Earth Mother, Mother Gaia, were in a relationship, and they bred Jupiter and Kronos or Saturn, and these were the Titans. And of course, the story of this, and this wraps up, this is how the story goes in terms of this Aquarian Pisces energy, is that Kronos or Saturn wanted to overthrow his father. And we get to this whole nut of that particular relationship in terms of, it was the younger generation thinking, well, actually, we've got a different view of the world now. We've got a different ideas about how the leadership structure should work. And of course, Saturn has played and Kronos have played an incredibly important role in re-establishing, you know, the structures that we have today. So the Uranian energy is actually a metaphor of breaking some of that up. And we've just talked about the second cycle of Saturn. So going back to the 60s and thinking, what is the arc? You know, what has come out of the 60s that we're now dealing with today? What can we learn? And therefore, how can we use, in a positive sense, that disruptive energy of change, which is what comes through Uranus? And of course, the conjunction with Jupiter, it's Jupiter, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the conjunction with Jupiter is that this is full-on expansion. So not only are the rulers, the leaders, cast out of the tower, which is really again another metaphor of a bottom-up uprising, which was what we saw in the 60s. It's time for new ideas, and it's time for the Aquarian energy, the concepts of collaboration, the concepts of connection, the concepts of community, the concepts of new technologies as well. You know, Aquarius is about technology, taking us forward. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot of darkness and light contesting there, typically in the whole AI scenario, but this is part of the threshold of what we're having to deal with right now. And I was listening to a blog the other day that was talking, and I agree with this, is that this Uranian Jupiter energy is about understanding that the concepts of polarity, like there's only black and white, there's left and right, there's conservative and Republicans, or Republicans and Democrats, for example, whatever it is, there's polarity everywhere. And that part of us moving into the age of Aquarius is to understand that there's actually a third way, which is the best of both. It's not, we don't have to be camped over on this side or camped over on that side. We can actually take the best of this and the best of that and blend it. And that's part of that Uranian message with Jupiter, is that take the best of, and we're kind of wrapping this all up. And we talked in the very beginning about dissolution and emergence. We talked about the role of Mercury. We talked about the importance of of understanding where we've come from and where we're going to. We see it manifesting everywhere, and part of that polarity, where we're so far often when it comes to having a conversation about the way to move forward for humanity, both individually, whether it's in the family, whether it's in the, like you mentioned, the school board, whether it's in the way that the local water pump is run, however we spend our money, our collective commons, those ideas have been so male dominated, so masculine dominated, so left brain dominated. But of course, Pallas Athena and Lilith there and Ophiuchus are saying that's not going to work anymore.
No.
So we see this beautiful convergence of these energies everywhere in the 13th sign that is saying, actually, we're on the cusp of something pretty amazing. And obviously the microcosm reflects the macrocosm. We have to firstly understand that leadership starts in the home. It's the way that we behave towards each other, and it's the way that we behave towards our neighbors. It's the way that we behave towards our children, if you've got them. And it's also understanding that these ideas have had their time. They've served, but now it's time for something new, and breaking new wineskins. The oak barrel will only last so long before the wine starts to taste a little funky. So, what a combination. We're so excited about this, and hopefully when you are listening and re-listening and considering some of the ideas that were put forward here, you'll be just as excited.
That's right. Yes. So much knowledge to dive into. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective on it all. For those of you that rather listen on the go, you can also listen to us on Spotify. We prepare 13 sign natal charts, and you can also book a 2-hour reading with us, and we will just help you realign with the divine design for this lifetime. So I am excited for this change. Please let us know in the comments how you are finding this new format. And for those in the United States, let's hope for a cloudless day so you can observe this beautiful event in real life, in real time, and take action for that, what is important to you, and be open for new possibilities. Have you got any last parting words, David?
I don't, other than this is, there's so much talk about this eclipse. If you do a YouTube search, you will find everyone's talking about it, and they've got there's lots of perspectives, and that's actually a reflection in our view of the Mercurial influence here, that the influence of Mercury. There's going to be a lot of talk, but what we are trying to present is what is the context of that. And it's clear that this is about the leadership structures that we are living by and that are no longer serving us. That is the context. It's easy to talk. Talk is cheap. But what we have wanted to present here is that if we deep dive into the way that the astrological configuration is laid out through the 13 signs, it's very clear that this is about leadership and whatever that means for you, and having a conversation about that, looking inward, being the change you want to see in the world, but having a say. And that's kind of the summary, the closing piece for me.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So we look forward to doing more of these. The next one will definitely be the next full moon. So until that time, dive into our other videos that are all on YouTube. Thank you so much for your time.
Bye-bye.